All right, a 66 Bassman just came in. It's got an added master volume. It's a shame about that they drilled into the panel there. And a missing volume knob. Probably just moved to here. Someone probably just wasn't using the bass channel, but look at that more closely in a minute. All right, 66 iron all around. Replaced output tube sockets. I've cut the cable on this because this was at the other end, and that's just not reliable or safe. So I'm going to give it a new power cable without the safety hazard down here. If things pulling out, these things always fall apart over time. All right, first of all, let's look inside the doghouse. Okay, we've got 4 original caps, 2 replaced caps. Yeah, that one's beginning to leak. So all those are going to get changed out properly. Got that really shitty job where the new leads are just kind of twisted to the old leads. And I'll replace those dropping resistors while I'm in there and the balance resistors. If you see the Vibrolux video from last week, you'll see the whole process on changing that. Let's go to the other side. Okay, got some added jacks here on the rear panel. We'll look at that in a minute. Let's go from the output section. So ground's made to the hardware. Chassis is really dirty. That bias cap has been very poorly installed. Let me get this to focus a little bit better. I'll change out all 7 of those diodes and that resistor there and that cap, and I'll clean all that up. There's a lot of excess wiring here. I'll neaten all that up in the process. So here's that added master volume and its circuit, and this is a fairly shitty job. Good work does not require hot glue. Hot glue does not remain stable at high temperatures. So I'll get all that neatened up, and I'll put actually transparent master volume in there. That won't be quite such a Charlie Foxtrot as all this. And I'll get the bias so that you have both bias level and balance. It's got added 100 ohm resistors on the output to ground, which is a popular thing to do so that people can easily bias their amps. But I don't think that an owner has any business opening up an amp to set the bias that way, because you're still exposing the owner to risk. Much better to either not have these and for a tech to bias it internally, or for it not to have these and for the owner to use external bias measurements, which have the resistance built in from pin 8 to ground. But anyway, I digress. That'll get cleaned up. A lot of this old wiring will get cleaned up. It's had some heat issues in here. I suspect that's why the power tube sockets have been changed out. I'll see if those sockets are good, or whether they need to be changed out. That's wiring is not to code. I'll change all the wiring to be proper to code. All right, so that takes care of that. And that nasty master volume. Now this is the AB165, and we're going to keep the AB165 preamp with a couple of alterations which make it quieter. But we're going to change the output to AA864, which is the better sounding output section. And the amp will dramatically be quieter in terms of hiss, and its transition to breakup will be much nicer. This thing has already been semi-converted. Doesn't have the 220K local negative feedback that this amp originally would have had, but it's not enough. It's got to get all new electrolytics throughout, including these cathode bias caps. This circuit looks to be a very poorly installed effects loop with no built-in path to ground after the cap feeding it. It does have this cap to ground feeding after it, so that is a place to lose highs, and it's a good way to have positive voltage on the send if that cap were to leak. And it's an old cap, so it's likely to leak. And this amp does not need an effects loop, so that effects loop needs to go away. Some really fugly things happening in here. I'm not going to worry about what they are. I'm just going to put everything back in here to the proper stock circuit, which will sound fantastic. Neaten things up as I go. Given the amount of gain in the preamp on these, I'll probably put some shielded wires from the inputs and volumes to the grids of the tubes. I'll wait until everything else is done and see where we're at. Sometimes you can get away without it. A lot of this is just going to be cleaning up nasty junk in there, really bad solder joints. There's no reason for a 66 Bassman to have work like that. A whole lot of nonsense in here. We'll get all that cleaned up and straightened out. And as dirty as this amp is, I would be very surprised if this board were not conductive. So cleaning the board very thoroughly and driving all the moisture and contaminants out will be part of this. It's a lot of work to get these singing again, but it's so worth it. When it's working properly, this circuit can be fantastic. And the combination of the AB165 preamp and the AA864 power amp results in the world's best sounding Bassman of the black face and silver face. I need to start saying black panel and silver panel just because it's such a fraught issue. It's hard to unlearn that term, but I think it's important going forward to say black panel, silver panel. If you disagree, please don't put it in the comments. That's just divisive, and I'm trying to be less divisive. Anyway, I digress. But it's the amp that Fender never made but should have. Their best sounding 60s Bassman preamp with their best sounding 60s Bassman power section. And I've done this on a few before. The owner of this amp has two. I've already done it to the first one. He loves it, loves it, loves it. And he brought this in to be made the same. So when this amp is done, it will still have the master volume, just a much better implementation of the master volume. It will not have this nasty, useless effects loop. And I'll put some nice plugs there to cover up the old holes there. And in the course of doing this, I may find other things. I'll check these screen grid resistors, which look to be about 2 watts. They may, it's better than the 1 watts that were stock, not as good as a 3 or 5 watt for the job. Some really ugly solder joints in there. These grounds I don't trust because the solder joints aren't good. It takes the right temperature to solder the chassis. Surprising number of techs who charge for their work don't have the gear to get it there, which is a shame. Anyway, I predict a very happy ending for this amp. And of course, the little things like, are all the pots good? Are all the jacks good? And we'll discover all that as we go. First of all, I just got to get a lot of this junk out and get to a clean slate. All that lovely filth there was between the mounting hardware and the chassis, there for the bias ground. Similar yuck here for the main grounds for the reservoir caps and center tap of the HT supply. This is why you should never use transformer mounting hardware to chassis. Not only does it come loose over time and corrosion builds up, but it gets loose. This is not a path to good grounds. I'm going to be putting some Keps nuts in to hold that stuff securely, and then I'll be resoldering directly to chassis. I'll show that later. Let's get this to focus where I want it. Okay, I've got stuff out that either was known to be bad or measured way out of spec. Some of the plate resistor is supposed to be 100K. We're measuring 140 something K. Anything over 20% out of tolerance is really questionable. And some stuff had just been tack soldered using solder as glue. I'll replace all that stuff properly. But the majority of the original stuff that matters, which is pretty much just the blue axial Ajax coupling caps, are good. All the pots seem to be original. I've decided I'm going to change out these output sockets. They're of unknown make, and they were all soldered very poorly by the previous guy. So I'm going to replace them with some phenolics, which will be very similar to what was in there originally, and redo it all the right way to start. So, got to get ugly before it gets pretty, right?